CPI just climbed 2.7% year over year, but guess what? It's not Trump's tariffs driving the surge. It's shelter costs. With credit stress rising and FICO scores slipping, what's next for your wallet? Stay tuned to uncover the real inflation culprit and how it impacts your finances moving forward.
One of our first topics, which is the CPI. So we had the CPI. There's always been a lot of talk that tariffs were going to be this huge increase, but you're starting to see some waffling. You're starting to see CPI creep up. Powell's still going to hold the course. What are you thinking in terms of what happens, what has happened, and what's going to happen going forward?
Thanks, Mark. So this is one where DKI has been early and right. Just a couple of months ago on Liberation Day, the market completely freaked out. The FinX community or FinTwit community, depending on your view of time, went completely hysterical. Oh no, tariffs are going to destroy the economy. We're going to have horrible inflation. It's coming right away. But that's not what happened. And I came out early and said this may not be the disaster everybody's expecting. Tariffs typically don't lead to inflation. They lead to an increase in domestic production and shifting to lower cost alternatives. We cited all kinds of research on that. And, so far we've been right on this. And one thing I think is really interesting is all the hysterical fiat economists, and I say that with more sarcasm than I normally use, they're now saying, well, yeah, we're still going to have a disaster. We're still going to have inflation, but we won't see it until like October or November. Okay, well, but in April, they were saying it's imminent, and it simply hasn't happened. Going to last week's CPI, that's the Consumer Price Index. When people talk about inflation, that's typically the number that they look at. The overall increase was 2.7%. That was up just a little bit from May and 0.1% above expectations. The core CPI, that's the number that excludes food and energy because nobody needs either one of those things, was up 2.9% versus last year. God, I'm not normally so snarky, but it's just really hard with stuff like this. Anyway, the yearly core number was 0.1% above last month's 2.8%, in line with expectations. Look, these numbers are too high, but they've been too high for years at this point. There's really been no evidence that tariffs are taking hold or creating any kind of lasting inflation problem. The main reason for the increase in the CPI was shelter. That's the fancy finance word for housing. That's been on an upward trend for years and really isn't affected by any kind of tariff concerns. On the consumer side, we're seeing increasing signs of consumer credit stress. This is not a surprise to anybody who watches this show on a weekly basis. We've got buy now, pay later loans. That's $1 trillion plus that's now being reported to credit scoring agencies. Many Americans are seeing their FICO credit scores fall as a result of that. Credit card delinquencies are increasing. Auto loan delinquencies are increasing. And those with student loans are now responsible, again, for making payments. That's leading to further decreases in credit quality for millions of people. Mark, one thing that really surprises me on this one is I keep seeing reports from people who have student loans complaining that now they have to reduce discretionary spending because the multi-year break they've had from payments has expired. I think it's really interesting that so many people who knew that they had debt chose to spend the temporary break from payment requirements rather than save or invest the money, in which case they'd be much better off. I think our culture needs to have a change in our relationship with spending and debt. That change, by the way, should start in Congress. We're not just picking on the student loan people. It should start at the very highest levels of the country. Concluding on this one, I agree with current consensus. The Fed's going to keep rates unchanged at the next meeting. The difficulty they'll have is a lower overnight rate is going to lead to higher 10-year rates as the bond market prices in higher expected future inflation. So I don't, President Trump and Chairman Powell can fight all they want. I don't think there's a whole lot that Powell can do to resolve this. So that's my view on it. I think the CPI, really no impact, and the Fed's going to pause. What's your view on this?
So before I go into my view, I have a question for you. So you talked about 2.9%. I know that what I'm spending monthly is by no means 2.9%. Are you seeing something similar? What is the disconnect between what we're seeing on a monthly basis and what is actually being reported?
Yeah, look, I've been talking about how the CPI has been horribly inaccurate for about 4 years now. The shelter increases are not being captured. There's a huge disconnect between the rental market and the the rental market and the purchase market. More importantly, the place where I see a huge disconnect is in food. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which compiles the CPI, they've been saying that food inflation is somewhere in the 1 to 3% range for years now. Every time I see that, I write the same thing and I challenge everybody, if your grocery bills, if your food bills, if your restaurant bills are up only 2 or 3% in the last year, I want to hear from you. No, exactly nobody has taken me up on that. We've seen reports of just, 20 people spending 20% or more. I don't believe the numbers. I don't think anybody else does either.
So Powell's going to pause. I 100% agree with you on that. But if he didn't, and for some reason he cuts, would it actually matter?
No. The reason I think it wouldn't matter, and this is something that people don't understand, and unfortunately, as much as I think President Trump has made some really good economic decisions, I'm not sure he fully understands this either. The Federal Reserve only controls the Fed funds rate. That is the overnight rate. That really only affects the big banks, right? The bond market determines the rest of the yield curve. And so let's go back to last September, where over the course of 2 or 3 months, the Fed cut by 100 basis points. Again, that's just fancy finance speak for they cut by 1%. And we saw an increase in the yield on the 10-year of 1%. So basically, they went from a negative slope on the yield curve and an inverted yield curve where you had high short-term rates and low long-term rates to a normal yield curve where you have low short-term rates and high long-term rates. But that wasn't how they wanted it to happen, right? They wanted the yield on the 10-year to come down, the bond market pricing in higher expected future inflation, basically said, yeah, we don't believe you. You can cut all you want, but the cost of capital is the cost of capital. And that's the thing I think a lot of people don't understand. The Federal Reserve does not control anything longer than the overnight rate, and the market doesn't want, they talk about wanting lower rates, but I don't think they really want to see it. What do you think? What do you think happens if they cut at the next meeting? What do you think happens to the 10-year yield?
I think it spikes. I've been saying from the beginning that when you look at Volcker did a lot of hard work to get in front of inflation by gunning rates as high as he could and then bringing them down slowly because he wanted to give the view or the perspective that, hey, I control this. And then a lot of the Fed managers and Fed chairmen after that have essentially benefited from that hard work, but now that is gone. That Band-Aid has been ripped off, and I think people are finally coming to terms. And by people, I mean those that aren't boomers, not to pick on the boomers here, but there's a huge view because that's where I fight the most. They're like, Powell needs to cut rates. He's being political. I need my prices to come down. And it's like, guys, that's not how that works, actually. There is going to be a big disconnect. And I think people forget about what happened with that cut in September, how that spiked the long duration, and then there's this view that it's like, oh well, don't worry, Bassett can go from just selling long duration debt to just selling short duration debt. It's like, okay, there is some truth in that in terms of volume, but even that has a maximum. And there's a view that isn't going to be the case, and you're just going to see a rebalancing in terms of where the debt is issued, but you're still going to see inflation. You're still going to see deficit spending, and it's only going to make the clearing price, or because price and yield are inverse, as the price goes down because people are like, I'm not bidding on this, it means that the clearing price goes at the yield in order to get people to buy goes up. And that is where you're going to see that biggest cost because we are firmly in a debt spiral. The M2 shows that in terms of your comments about where inflation is going. When you look at the money supply, it continues to grow. So you're already seeing some sort of QE in there. Tariffs, when you look at who's paying for them, right now they're coming from the producers. And, and if you really want to see where tariff pricing is going to hit, you have to look at PPI, that producer price index, because it's going to show you what are our what are our import prices. If those are exploding, if those import prices are just absolutely gunning higher, that's tariff. that's a cost. But right now they've been very stable, and it's because the producers from a foreign entity are willing to backstop it, and they're willing to compete to still get into the U.S. markets. And then when you look at CPI, I have to laugh because as somebody who has to buy, obviously health insurance, my health insurance is now more expensive than both my mortgage and my and my homeowner's insurance. But yet when you look at where healthcare sits in that grand scheme of things, it's still well below 25%. And I love when you start looking at why CPI missed. It's because used cars and airline tickets went down. It's like, well, I don't eat airline tickets.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I can buy a ticket to get on the plane to eat their food. But it's like, guys, like, how is this balanced? So when you think of the number, I always think it's just it's a fake number that is used to try to direct whatever policy they want. But even the fake numbers that are still going higher because of the pressure that we're seeing.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, they were showing that health insurance costs were down. That is clearly not true. They've more than doubled in the last few years. I mean, just so many of these expenses are way up for people. A couple of extra points I would make on this, besides the fact that healthcare is criminally understated in the CPI, among some other things. Like by the way, my homeowner's insurance has doubled in the last few years, right? And you can't go without that, and that is not being reflected. Separately from that, for all the people saying, well, we need Powell to lower rates. Again, I agree with Mark that if Powell lowers the Fed funds rate, we see an increase in the 10-year. That's how mortgage rates are priced, right? So what I'm telling you is if Powell cuts, I think we're going to see an increase in mortgage rates, and that's going to be really rough for people. Anybody who has to refinance, that's going to create hardship for a lot of people. That's not the direction we want to see things going. The other thing is, Mark makes a great point on economic history when he was talking about Volcker jacking up rates as high as he could. He's referring to Paul Volcker, who was the former chairman of the Federal Reserve. This is back in the late 70s, early 80s. And that's when we had the horrible stagflation of that time, where the misery index, the misery index was defined as inflation plus the unemployment rate. It was over 20%. And what Volcker did was he took the Fed funds rate to right around 20%. And then, as Mark said, he lowered it very slowly. The reason that Powell can't do that now is because we now have $37 trillion of debt. Our debt to GDP number is completely different. We are not Japan, but we've got the same problem, right? Which is the central bank really does need to raise rates, but doing so blows out the budget. The only thing you can do in that moment, if you're the US government, is to print more dollars to pay the difference, and wait, that leads to more inflation. This is why I say the Fed is trapped. So Volcker had flexibility back in the late 70s and early 80s that current Chairman Powell does not have. So that's your economic history lesson for the day, doing all we can to try to keep it interesting.
Well, and the last point that I love on the history lesson, and again, not to get political, but everyone's like, "Oh, Trump! This is the first time a president has ever gone after the person." I'm like,
Not
"Well,
true.
Lyndon Johnson threw the chairman against the wall.
Burns.
Truman threatened to launch the Fed chairman. I believe it was off of a warship. So everyone as early as recent as Obama said that Bernanke has stayed too long and is out of touch. So again, there's a lot of things where there's always been conflict between these two entities, and it's unlikely to resolve anytime soon because one wants to spend and the other, in theory, should want some sort of economic fortitude in terms of ensuring that we will exist tomorrow versus spend our way out of everything.
Yeah, yet again, President Trump gets the blame for mean words when, you're right, Lyndon Johnson actually picked up Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns and slammed him into a wall. Something that I'm pretty sure President Trump will not attempt with Chairman Powell.